I want to get back to our guests who've been with us listening into what the president delivered tonight. Al Hunt, Washington editor, is here with us. Also, John Podesta, former chief of staff to the Clinton White House, and, of course, John Sununu, former Republican senator from New Hampshire and a colleague here at Bloomberg. Al, grade on performance and content.
B on performance, C on content.
C on content. Wow. Are you also going to be a harsh grader on content here?
Well, I think he gave up a lot on the content because it was a political speech. So as a result, Al hit it on the head. In the middle, it was kind of a laundry list. There was nothing really new, certainly no big ideas. And the themes he talked about, energy, education, manufacturing, I mean, that's really a staple for any State of the Union speech going back for decades. So you can't give him a good grade on content. C-
on content is what you're giving him?
Sure.
B- on
sure.
Performance.
The performance, he's a good speaker, but I think in some ways it wasn't that sharp politically.
All right, John Podesta.
Well, Margaret, I think he really got the job done tonight. I gave him an A- on content because I think it wasn't a warm and fuzzy speech. It was a challenging speech. He challenged the Republican leadership, particularly in the House, to come with him on manufacturing, on making the United States a clean energy powerhouse again, and he challenged them to be less partisan.
Podesta, jump in here because Rahm Emanuel actually said that Mitch Daniels would have been one of the strongest contenders against President Obama. Are you happy he's not running?
Well, I think, the rhetorical frame I think that he put forward tonight was pretty solid. And maybe he's trying out for a late entry into the primaries. Who knows? I'm sure there are a lot of Republicans around the country who look at the choices they have right now and wish there was something else, or at least none of the above. But I think
John Sununu's
I think that in the end of the day, this was a fairly contentless speech. He basically, the only really specific he came out against was efficient light bulbs. I don't know whether that takes you to the presidency. And I think it really is in the details that I think that both Romney and Gingrich are beginning to stumble. It's not just their personal past, but what they're putting forward to the American people. And that's where I think people wish that a guy like Daniels was out there with some other
Does
ideas.
he join a Romney or Gingrich ticket?
No. Well, I don't know. I don't know who the nominee
Would you want
will
him
choose. I think it'd be very strong on any ticket. There's no question. I think having chief executive experience, having the great budget and fiscal background he has is very important. Look, this is a tough speech to deliver, especially on the content side, because he is not laying out a detailed, specific platform that all Republicans can sign up for in the way that the president does. Two things that I think he emphasized in a very clear way, and in a way that differs than the president. One is on jobs. The fact is the employment situation is much worse than the president painted because of the chronic underemployment and the fact so many people have left the rolls. And second, the debt. And the fact that we're teetering so close to where Europe is today.
I've got to interrupt you because I know Ohio Senator Rob Portman is standing by with us right now on Capitol Hill. He was, of course, White House budget director under George W. Bush, also served on the Deficit Reduction Super Committee that was unable to reach a deal last year. Senator, thank you for joining us this evening. Also want to dig into your trade experience. There's a new unit, the Trade Enforcement Unit. The president talking tough on China, something Mitt Romney has done on the campaign trail. What's your reaction?
Well, Margaret, I thought there were 4 or 5 tidbits in the speech that I agreed with. That was certainly one of them. Having better enforcement of our trade laws and international standards makes sense. We also need to be sure, though, to expand our exports. And the president, unfortunately, has not asked for the ability to negotiate trade agreements. He's the first president since FDR not to ask for that. So we can do a lot more in terms of exports, but the president needs to be bolder. He needs to actually ask for trade negotiating authority. Congress would give it to him, and then we could actually begin negotiating some of these trade agreements and knocking down barriers, helping U.S. farmers, workers, and service providers. So I would like to have seen a lot more on trade in terms of what we can do to actually create jobs.
Well, he did talk about Panama, Colombia, also South Korea in there. Would you give him credit for having achieved those things over the past year?
Yeah, I was very involved in that, as you know, negotiating those 5 years ago. It took us 5 years to get them done, 4 years because the Democrats in the House wouldn't move on them, and then 9 months for this president to move on them. So those were commercially beneficial to the United States of America. They should have been passed 4 or 5 years ago. In the meantime, we've done nothing in terms of the international trade agreements. We have no bilateral agreements going on right now. There are hundreds going on without us. But the United States is on the sidelines, and we're falling behind. I also got to tell you, Margaret, I was very disappointed that the speech didn't talk about the need for us to get our spending under control. It's almost like we're living in different worlds here. In Washington, maybe people are forgetting about the fact that we have and historic debt, historic deficits. We are looking at the real possibility of heading down the road of Greece and other southern European countries unless we get this under control. And the president, as I count it, had 7 new ways for us to spend more money. And with regard to any kind of spending constraints, said he'll only consider it with huge new taxes.
Very quickly, I want to ask you, the president spent a fair amount of time talking about opening up energy resources in this country. A lot of Republicans upset about the White House rejection of the Keystone Pipeline. Is this a compromise? Is this something down the middle here?
I don't know. I was delighted to hear the president say that he's interested in opening up more federal lands. I think that's what he said. He didn't talk about the Keystone XL pipeline. I'd hope that he would address that and explain why he believes that's not a good idea. Yeah, I think he also is interested in energy efficiency, which is a good thing. I have legislation with Senator Shaheen. We were sitting next to each other tonight. It's a bipartisan bill, and we thought he pretty much described our bill. And so I think there's some things we can do this year as a Congress. One certainly would be on the trade area with enforcement, and the president would ask for it to give him the ability to negotiate agreements. Another would be energy efficiency, and some of the energy you talked about in terms of fracking and hydraulic fracking will generate a lot more natural gas, particularly. And then finally, I think there's an opportunity this year to do something on corporate tax reform. I was glad the president raised it. I was concerned that he wants to punish U.S. companies that dare to do business overseas, because that's exactly the wrong way to go. But I do think he's on the right track that our corporate tax rate is way too high.
All right, Senator, thank you very much for joining us and giving us your reaction. Welcome back. We've been listening to the State of the Union, the Republican response. Let's get reaction right now from David Stockman, President Reagan's budget director, who joins us now live from New York. Thanks for making time. Did you hear the economic blueprint that the president promised to deliver? Anything you can embrace in there?
Well, not so much. I note that I'm the 3rd ex-budget director in a row that you've had on here. And maybe it's not coincidental, because what I heard was the president talk for an hour basically about things he can't do much about, like the energy economy or manufacturing jobs, and somehow in that entire span ignored the elephant in the room, which is the fact the United States government is broke, and that he had a near-death experience last summer trying to pass the debt ceiling increase. Yet we heard, by my count, almost 24 different tax credits, tax cuts, spending programs, new initiatives that somehow he wants to stuff into a budget that's already hemorrhaging red ink. Now, I agree, for instance, that we ought to be cutting the defense budget drastically. But why would he want to then recycle half of it back into programs that we really can't afford or don't need? I agree we should put a tax, a transaction tax, on financial institutions, but that money needs to go into deficit reduction, not some kind of willy-nilly benefits for selected homeowners. I agree, frankly, with the Buffett tax. But again, that money should go to reducing this massive deficit we have, and not for this laundry list of programs that we heard about tonight.
Viewers who heard me mention that you worked in the Reagan administration are now questioning whether I should have said that, because you are breaking with a number of tried and true Republican principles there. I mean, you just supported a tax on financial institutions and the like. Can you explain to me, in the president's description here, how he could imagine a tax on multinationals that would incent them to move jobs back to the U.S. and discourage them from creating jobs outside the U.S.? How do you do that?
Well, I don't think that makes any sense at all. I was talking about the individual rate. I would only point out that the greatest achievement of Ronald Reagan was the 1986 tax reform, which broadened the base, cut the rates, left capital gains at 30%, left the top rate at 30%, and that was a good system. Where we are today is with capital gains and other returns on capital at 15%, and earned income being taxed at more than double that rate, 35%. That's the problem. And frankly, I think there's nothing wrong with getting back to the way that Ronald Reagan left the tax system in good shape in 1986. Ironically, the Republicans aren't going to point this out, but effectively, with some adjustments, that's where you could end up if you tried to implement what he was talking about on the tax side.
Well, when you go back to what you just said, you agree with the proposed Buffett taxes. I mean, we've been talking about capital gains. We've been talking about carried interest a lot out there as relates to Mitt Romney. Is there a political cost here and an economic one bundled together? I mean, what's becoming inevitable?
Well, I think it's both. In other words, there was a case for a lower capital gains rate in the 1970s when we had high inflation and you didn't want to tax phantom gains. But that is long past. We have no inflation today. There is no real fundamental economic reason for having almost no taxation on gains, especially if they result from inside buildup in highly leveraged companies or real estate. And on the other hand, taxing people who provide professional services or labor at this higher rate. So it seems to me that the Republicans have gotten themselves into a tremendous political trap by continuing to insist that the tax reduction on capital income that was, I think, erroneously put in during the Bush era be preserved. It makes it appear that they're out there to defend the top 1% or 2%, and that is not a winning formula, I can't believe.
No, there are a lot of people going to be asking for exactly that formula. David Stockman, interesting to get your response. Thank you very much for making time throughout the past few hours here with us at Bloomberg Studios. I've had great support here from Al Hunt, our Washington editor. Also with us, John Podesta, former chief of staff in the Clinton White House. Also John Sununu, Bloomberg colleague now and former Republican senator from New Hampshire. Now, right at the get-go here, John, you said David Stockman has reversed some policies, broken with the party, and you didn't necessarily agree with some of what he now proposes.
Sure.
What's your
well, you
reaction?
mentioned the transaction tax, for example, but setting
on financial institutions.
Exactly. Setting that aside, I think most Republicans would agree with most of what David Stockman just talked about. One, especially.
You support the Buffett tax?
No. Well, first of all, no one even knows what that means.
Right.
Let's be honest and serious. That's just sort of rhetorical tripe at this point.
Supposedly over $1 million.
Right. Let's go through this one at a time, though. So first, we have the spending issue. And David Stockman pointed it out, Rob Portman pointed it out. There was no real discussion from the president of reducing spending. There were a handful of new spending programs and dozens of new tax cuts and credits that would only increase the deficit. The second thing that David Stockman talked about, which I think is really important, was real tax reform. Okay, so this idea of moving back toward where Reagan was in '86 with a much broader base, a lower top rate, and a capital gains rate that's more closely aligned with that top rate that deals with the Buffett discrepancy. So to talk about a Buffett tax is meaningless, but to talk about real tax reform that broadens the base and reduces the discrepancy between a capital gain and an earned income,
right,
that's at least consistent. And David Stockman makes the argument pretty well.
Do you agree?
Look, when was the last time we balanced the budget? It was during the Clinton administration, 3 years in a row.
I thought Newt Gingrich did that.
Yeah, I've heard him say that on the trail. But most of that work got done in the '93 economic plan that Clinton passed. We had higher taxation, but we had much stronger growth, 23 million jobs created in the United States during that period of time. We need fundamental tax reform. I agree with John about that.
You also had supported monetary policy in there that had some risk associated with it as well.
I think that the fiscal policy that the president put forward supported the monetary policy that was then able to power a strong private sector recovery. And that's, I think, what we need to get back to. I think what really David Stockman's saying, though, is that at the presidential level, the candidates are going in exactly the opposite direction. If you look at Romney's tax plan, for example, another $1 trillion in the hole, mostly aimed at the top 1%. He actually, which really is startling, raises taxes on people making under $100,000 a year who have children in this country. I think that's a kind of, people don't know that. I think they'll be startled to learn it.
Well, the president did reference 98% of Americans make $250,000 a year or below. Why did he get that specific in here?
because that's the group that he wants to get votes from in November. Margaret, simple proposal. Put Simpson bowls on the floor of the House and ideally the Senate. Let each side offer 3 or 4 amendments and have an up and down vote.
Not in the speech, but we will see what happens. Al and John Sununu, John Podesta, thank you so much.